Okay, hey everybody, it's Mr. Perry. I just wanted to read the first couple chapters of Great Expectations with you so that you could get a sense of what we might be talking about and what the book is about and how Charles Dickens writes. The edition I'm using today is this one, but you can use any copy of Great Expectations. We won't necessarily be looking at individual page numbers or anything like that, so it doesn't matter too much which one you use. One little caveat here, and that is that I'm not very good at accents, so I won't be doing British accents for the characters, but hopefully that doesn't matter too much. So the first couple chapters of Great Expectations set the stage for the whole book. And we're reading this because it's a classic, but also because Charles Dickens writes in a really interesting and original way. Most of his books were actually written as serials, kind of like modern-day TV series, where people would wait with great expectations for the next installment to come out every couple weeks or every month. And he would produce them like this over several years sometimes. Great Expectations, despite its great number of pages, is actually one of his shorter books. And one of his most accessible, and that's why we're going to read it. So you might get lost even in the first couple chapters if I weren't here to help you understand what the heck the narrator is talking about. So the narrator it's a first-person narration, which means it's narrated by the main character himself. And in the first chapter, he tells you his name and he tells you a little bit about his family, but in kind of a peculiar way. So here we go. My father's family name being Pirrup, and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip, and came to be called Pip. I gave Pirrup as my father's family name on the authority of his tombstone and my sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. As I never saw my father or my mother, and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. The shape of the letters on my father's gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man, with curly black hair. From the character in turn of the inscription, also Georgiana, wife of the above, I drew a childish conclusion that my mother was freckled and sickly. To 5 little stone lozenges, each about 1.5 feet long, which were arranged in a neat row beside their grave and were sacred to the memory of 5 little brothers of mine, who gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early in their universal struggle. I am indebted for a belief I religiously entertained that they had all been born on their backs with their hands in their trousers pockets and had never taken them out in this state of existence. Okay, so you're probably bored already. But that's okay, because we read a lot of the classics, partly because at first they seem a little boring, but they actually contain a lot more than we see on the surface. So let's just go through these first 2 paragraphs. And if you don't have your book in front of you, why don't you go get it, pause this, and then come back, so that you can see what I'm talking about. So he tells us right away that his name is Pip, but he does it in kind of a weird way. He tells us that he couldn't say either his first name, Philip, or his last name, Pirrup, and so he just said Pip, Pip, Pip. That's what he called himself. It's kind of a neat thing that he comes right out and tells us a story of how he got his name. In a sense, he's actually, from a very small child, been creating his own identity. This book is largely about how he figures out who he is and what happens to him and how he processes all of that and creates a self called Pip. So that's a theme right from the very beginning. Then he tells us this weird story about how he came to picture his parents. So he's in a graveyard, basically, and he's looking at the gravestones of his mother and his father. And since he has no images in his head of what they looked like, because they died when he was young, he tells us that his images come from the fonts in which that the inscriptor used on the gravestones. So the font on his father's grave makes him think his father is square and stout, so it's some sort of squarish font. And his mother is more loopy and curly, and so he has a different image of her, and maybe the stone is freckled, so that's why he thinks of her as freckled. Then we've got this weird image of the 5 little stone lozenges. Now, we think of lozenges as like cough drops or something, but what he means is little grave markers. And so these 5 little grave markers of his brothers who all died very early on, or as he says, they gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early in the universal struggle. So he just, Pip, the narrator, and Dickens, the writer, have odd ways of saying sort of normal things, or in this case, not such a normal thing. But there's also a sense of dark humor here, and that is that he's kind of being funny about all of these dead members of his family. And that'll be a theme throughout this book and throughout all of Charles Dickens. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Ours was the marsh country down by the river, within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon toward evening. At such a time I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with nettles was the churchyard, and that Philip Purip, late of this parish, his father, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, his mother, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low, leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant, savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry was Pip. So that paragraph sets the setting of where Pip lives. He lives 20 miles from the sea in England. It's a very marshy area, not unlike some of the Bay Area, which you can see a little bit out the windows of the houseboat here. But it also has kind of a dark and gray feeling, kind of depressing, a low leaden line, which is good alliteration, by the way, is this river, the River Thames, further out near the ocean. And he also refers to himself in the third person. He calls himself that small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all. So he's already setting the stage with a sense of fear. He's, I think, 6 years old at this point in the novel, and he's a scared little kid, and some scary things are about to happen to him. "Hold your noise!" cried a terrible voice as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a great iron on his leg. A man with no hat, and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied around his head. A man who had been soaked in water, and smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars, who limped, and shivered, and glared, and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Pray don't do it, sir." "Tell us your name," said the man. "Quick!" "Pip, sir." "Once more," said the man, staring at me. "Give it mouth." Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said the man. "Point out the place." I pointed to where our village lay on the flat inshore among the alder trees and pollards, a mile or more from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that he made it go head over heels before me, and I saw the steeple under my feet. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone, trembling while he ate the bread ravenously. Okay, so this is pretty scary, right? This little kid, he's in the graveyard, he's trying to digest the fact that his parents and many siblings have died. And the scary guy with an iron on his leg, we'll find out what that means more in a minute, shows up, starts yelling at him, picks him upside down, tips him upside down, and dumps out his pockets, and then puts him on top of a gravestone. "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips. "What fat cheeks you got." I believe they were fat, though I was at that time undersized for my years and not strong. "Darn me if I couldn't eat 'em," said the man with a threatening shake of his head, "and if I hadn't a mind to." I earnestly expressed my hope that he wouldn't, and held tighter to the tombstone on which he had put me, partly to keep myself upon it, partly to keep myself from crying. "Now looky here," said the man. "Where's your mother?" "There, sir," said I. He started, made a short run, and stopped and looked over his shoulder. "There, sir," I timidly explained. "Also Georgiana. That's my mother." Of course, he's pointing at the gravestone. "Oh," said he, coming back. "And is that your father along your mother?" "Yes, sir," said I. "Him too, late of this parish." "Ha!" he muttered then, considering. "Who do you live with, supposing you're kindly let to live, which I hadn't made up my mind about?" "My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir." "Blacksmith, eh?" said he, and looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and me several times, he came closer to my tombstone, took me by both arms, and tilted me back as far as he could hold me, so that his eyes looked most powerfully down into mine, and mine looked most helplessly up into his. "Now looky here," he said. "The question being whether you're to be let to live, you know what a file is?" "Yes, sir." "And you know what whittles is?" "Yes, sir." After each question he tilted me over a little more, so as to give me a greater sense of helplessness and danger. "You get me a file." He tilted me again. "And you get me whittles." He tilted me again. "You bring 'em both to me." He tilted me again. "Or I'll have your heart and liver out." He tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened, and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said, if you would kindly please to let me get upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could attend more." Okay, so, a little explanation. So, many characters in Dickens speak in rough ways or in colloquial ways that weren't exactly like proper English at the time. Whittles is actually the way this guy is pronouncing the word victuals, which in itself is like a slang version of victuals, which are food items. So all he's saying is, you need to get me a file and get me some food. Now, a file, in this case, would be a file that a blacksmith would be using. So this is not like a nail file. This is like a serious tool. And the tool could be used to file away iron, or to break through iron, which this guy has on his leg. And if you haven't figured out by now, he's a convict, escaped convict, and the iron on his leg is part of the chains that were holding him in prison somewhere. He gave me a most tremendous dip and roll, so that the church jumped over its own weathercock. Then he held me by the arms in an upright position on the top of the stone, and went on in these fearful terms. "You bring me tomorrow morning early that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me at that old battery over yonder." And by the way, the battery in this case means like a military installation, kind of like in the Marin Headlands we have various batteries. "You do it, and you never dare to say a word or dare to make a sign concerning your having seen such a person as me, or any person somever, and you shall be let to live. You fail, or you go from my words in any particular, no matter how small it is, and your heart and your liver shall be tore out, roasted, and ate. Now, I ain't alone, as you may think I am. There's a young man hid with me, in comparison with which young man I am an angel. That young man hears the words I speak. That young man has a secret, way peculiar to himself, of getting at a boy, and at his heart, and at his liver. It is in vain for a boy to attempt to hide himself from that young man. A boy may lock his door, may be warm in bed, may tuck himself up, may draw the clothes over his head, may think himself comfortable and safe, but that young man will softly creep his way to him and tear him open. I am keeping that young man from harming of you at the present moment with great difficulty. I find it very hard to hold that young man off of your inside. Now, what do you say?" I said that I would get him the file, and I would get him what broken bits of food I could, and I would come to him at the battery early in the morning. "Say, Lord, strike you dead if you don't," said the man. I said so, and he took me down. "Now," he pursued, "you remember what you've